Hey, everybody, welcome back to the I Play 2 podcast. I'm your host, Rob Adler. This week, composer and audio engineer Roy Campanella III joins the show. Roy was a music supervisor for Brave New Voices 2010, which aired on HBO. Also, some of his music has been licensed for use in various shows such as Punk'd, Keeping Up with the Kardashians, and Bill Nye, the Science Guy. And now, Roy is doing the audio mix for the podcast With Great Power, which can be heard on Apple Podcasts. His grandfather, Roy Campanella, was a 3-time National League MVP for the then Brooklyn Dodgers when a car accident tragically ended his career. And Roy's father, Roy II, is a TV and film director whose credits include Knots Landing, Falcon Crest, Baywatch, and Beverly Hills 90210. Roy, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Rob. It's great to be on.
Thank you for doing this. I appreciate it. How are you doing today?
I'm great, man. I'm great. How are you?
Not too bad. I'm glad you're available and able to do it. I know you're busy at the moment.
I am fully into the media thing, whether it's podcasts or TV or shorts or commercials. That's my space, and everyone's got deadlines.
So how did your interest in music come to be?
Oh, wow. That's a great story. I had some friends who were really good instrumentalists around the age of 15. One of my friends was a professional musician at that age, although he still went to school, but he had like this side or weekend career as a professional musician. And it was just fun being around that. And some other friends who were not professional musicians at that age, but who were really good players. And I was like, how could I get into this? How could I express myself in this way? And I saw this film. I'm not sure if I can remember the name of this film. It was back in the 80s. And the guy spills champagne on his computer. His computer comes to life and starts making music. And I was like, wow, what if I could use computers to make music? Now, this was the 80s. And so computers were like an Apple IIc. I mean, not what we have today. And so it was really a very new thing. And as I discovered and read more about what computers were capable of and the new technologies they were creating to interface computers and MIDI software synthesizers, I just decided this was what I wanted to do. And I convinced my dad to get me a computer and a synth, and I started making music. And I really kind of never looked back. But it did sort of also start from this relationship I have with my father, where he really nurtured this idea of storytelling and filmmaking as something to explore. We'd go to the movies and he would explain the techniques behind what we were seeing, whether it was how to write a 3-act structured story and then how you have a turnaround and all of those sort of things behind films. And it just gave me this real fascination with storytelling and how to support storytelling. And then I had this interest in sound and music. And I sort of put the two together, and that was the beginning of my career, working on shows, like you said, Bill Nye, the Science Guy, which I got to do, I think it was 2 seasons of, and then doing things like commercials, a bunch of other things.
First thing is, I know the movie you're referencing. I believe it was Electric Dreams.
Yes, that's right.
And the ironic thing is, I am not a movie person at all, but I remember seeing it when I was a kid. I want to say it came out when I was like 9 or 10. So we'll say like 1984, 1985, somewhere in there.
Exactly.
In terms of what your father kind of told you about blending things, what was some of the advice that he gave you that really has stuck with you to this day?
My dad and I just had a conversation about what I'm about to share. So I think there's 2 things that I really remembered with my dad that were really inspiring for me. One was him going through this program while he was working at CBS. He started out at CBS as an evening news, I think it was, editor. He worked with them to develop this program where he could go get an MBA and then he would be eligible for promotion. So he went, he got his MBA and he got the promotion. And I think that was inspiring for me to see like he wanted something and how he worked with the circumstances he had to go from being an editor to an executive at CBS. So that was sort of one thing that I learned from him is how to be a champion for your vision. And I guess the second thing I learned from him was very similar. I was in college And at the time, he was no longer working for CBS. He was independent. He had been directing TV for many years, but he really wanted to start this feature film production company. And he wrote up a whole proposal and he did a whole business plan and he went around tirelessly. I think it was for about 4 years, going to every studio, every filmmaker, every executive he could take a meeting with. And he pitched his idea and with passion and without really getting discouraged when people said no, because pretty much everyone said no. And that's sort of the end of this process. The head of BET at the time came back to him and said, I don't want to do the business plan that you're pitching, but I am starting a film production company and I need someone to run that for me. And I really feel like you're the right person for this. And that taught me the lesson that in some cases, the things that we're out there hustling for may not come to fruition in the version that we have in our heads. But just by being out there, being an advocate for yourself, speaking to people, talking with passion about what you do, other opportunities open up. And in some cases, they're even bigger opportunities. For my dad, in this case, he got to do a slate of films. I think it was like 10 films for BET. And it was the largest production that they had ever done at the time. And he basically got to implement his vision of this directors and creative collective, but under the umbrella of BET. And I just took away from that, like I said, being an advocate for yourself will bring opportunities. And I think that that has been something that has carried with me for my whole career. And I also try to share that with other people who are sort of new in their career, that sometimes whether or not you think that what you want to create is going to happen or not, whether it seems realistic or not, come up with a plan for it and talk to people about it. And you don't know what could happen as a result.
I'm curious here. When your dad was at CBS, did he ever get a chance to run into Walter Cronkite?
I don't know. That's a great question. I have this great memory of being at the CBS offices in Manhattan, sitting on my dad's lap while he's editing the evening news, and then like going to kind of like a cafe there. And I remember the hamburgers they had there. But I don't know if you ever got to meet Walter Cronkite in that context, but maybe when he was an executive and maybe at some of the award shows he went to.
I actually spoke to Cronkite once, and it was not that long before he passed away because I needed to license a piece of footage that he narrated. And there's a whole thing about rights and clearances that I'm sure you're familiar with. And he said yes, but CBS said no. And it became this whole kind of argument that it took a while to get resolved, but it got resolved.
Those kinds of things come up a lot in music and music licensing. When I worked as a music supervisor, certainly who has the rights to this? Who can ultimately sign off? Wait a second, there's this third contract nobody looked at that actually this is the publisher that has the rights. It can get pretty convoluted.
And it also depends on who owns it.
Absolutely. That's why you got to sort of handle that stuff as you're going to make sure that what you're cutting in or working on is even worth spending the time on.
When was the opportunity that you had that you realized, hey, this might be my first big break?
I've lived an amazingly privileged life. With my grandfather being who he is, that opened up certain doors for me. My father having the career that he had has opened up amazing doors for me. And my father introduced me to a music producer when I was about 18. I had just started college, who was working on a couple of films and was ready to hire someone to work as like an assistant engineer. That was a great opportunity. And I went to work for him for about a year, took a pause from college, worked on some records with him, worked on TV shows, worked on films. And then I got an offer from two different people for me to go work for them full time. That was a real turning point for me. Like, do I do this or do I finish college? And I decided to go back to college, finish college. And I was a little bit scared because those kind of opportunities are not that common. And they were great opportunities. It was my final year at UCLA, and I was in the music department offices, not because I was a music major, I was an economics major, but I love to visit the music offices and just check out the teachers, the staff there. And I happened to look down at a coffee table in the office and I saw this flyer saying wanted studio vision programmer. Basically, this flyer described all of my skills and like everything that I could do and everything that I was really good at in terms of editing music, creating music, using this particular software that this composer wanted to use. And I called the guy up, sent over a resume, met with him. Now, this was before I had graduated college. I had like about a month or 2 months left of college. And I went into his studio and I was like, wow, this is an even bigger studio than the one I had worked at the other guy's place. He had more of the kind of shows that I was interested in. And in fact, the show that he was mainly working on was Bill Nye the Science Guy. And not only would I get to work on that show, but I would also get to work with a number of hip hop acts that at the time were pretty big, like Cypress Hill. And I was like, wow, if I can get this gig, then I think I'm really on the right path because it really nailed what my skill set was at the time, the things that I was really good at. And he called the guy who I had worked for that year I had taken off from college. And that guy gave me an amazing recommendation. And so basically, I had a job doing my dream job a month before I graduated college. I knew what I was doing as soon as I graduated, and he couldn't wait for me to start. And what it was he had a smaller studio set up in the back of his big studio complex. And it was my own room. And I got to write, record, and produce music for him. And I was paid a full-time salary. I didn't have to worry about bringing in clients or anything like that. I just got to write music all day long. And he had a team of amazing instrumentalists that I got to work with. If I wrote a song that needed a guitar, there was a guitar player. If I needed a male vocalist, there was a male vocalist. If I needed someone for a Barbie commercial that could do a vocal for that, there was a team of vocalists who could do that kind of stuff. It really was, at the time, my dream job.
With the opportunity to write music, especially at a fairly young age, what was it like to have that freedom to be able to know that you could create your own vision in your early 20s?
That was really kind of amazing. Within about, I think, a month of me being there, my boss gave me a raise. He doubled my salary because he realized that he didn't have to oversee everything that I did, sort of what you're alluding to. He could pretty much give me full license to just give me a show, and he would do the pieces of music that he was really clear that he wanted. And then he would say, hey, just give it a shot, the rest of this. And 9 times out of 10, what I did worked. And he didn't get any revision notes from the producers working on the show. So like I described, it was kind of amazing. I would get an episode and I would see all the spots where he wanted to let me take a shot at things. Sometimes I would write something myself that didn't need instrumentation, but a lot of times I was all too eager to bring in the session musicians. I loved working with the guitarists that we got to work with on a lot of projects and vocalists, having them come in. I mean, I think one of my favorite memories is working on a CBS Grammys promo. And I'll never forget, my boss was just too busy. He was like, I can't even get to this. I just got this request from CBS. Can you come up with something? And I watched the promo and it was like Sheryl Crow and Michael Jackson. It was like 94, 97 or something like that. And I'm just watching the visuals, like their idea. It was amazing to be able to take this, come up with an idea. And then I said to him, oh, I need a guitar on it. Can I hire Mike? He's like, yeah, sure, no problem. Oh, I need a vocalist. Can I hire Julie? Yeah, sure, no problem. And put this whole piece of music together and then present it to him. And he was like, oh man, that's great. And then he plays it for the producers who are working on this promo. And they're like, we just have 2 changes. And basically my original vision all the way through to the final thing that aired on TV, it was like you were saying, it was like to be able to realize my vision at that young of an age. It was great. It was intoxicating in some ways.
When the promo aired, I hope you were with people so you could say, hey, that's me. What I just did, it's right there.
It's so funny. I don't think I've ever done that. I do remember being in an airport and having worked on some travel like commercial for San Diego, a tourism commercial or something like that. And I'm in an airport walking from terminal to terminal and I heard the piece of music and I was like, oh, that's pretty cool. And I remember calling the guy who I'd been working for and saying, hey, man, guess what I heard at the airport?
You mentioned San Diego. That's one of my favorite cities. Have you ever had a chance to go? I know you were at UCLA, but that doesn't mean you made it down the coast.
I lived in Los Angeles for like 30 years. So, yeah, I've been to San Diego many times. Funny thing is, I haven't really been to Mexico. I mean, I went to Mexico from Texas when I was working in Texas, but from Los Angeles, I never went to Mexico, but I have been to San Diego.
When you went to Mexico, did you go across the border from El Paso or were you like in Brownsville?
I forget actually because it was part of a tour. Actually, for a period of time, I worked on a tour with Engelbert Humperdinck, and he had this private show. This person in Mexico had like some mansion, and we drove across the border in like a small bus, actually. And I can't remember where we were in Texas when we went across the border, but it was right on the border.
I had a lot of names possibly for my list of music today, but Engelbert Humperdinck did not make that list. How did you end up working with him? Because that's kind of fascinating for me.
When I worked with him, it was not in the musical side of things. I was doing sales for his merchandise. A friend of mine had been working on the tour, and the previous merch person didn't work out. And she asked if I could step in for a period of time to help out. And so I got to basically tour the country, 2 weeks on the road, 2 weeks at home for about a year. And it was really fascinating. I mean, I really got to go to pretty much, it's going to sound funny, every casino town in America, if you can imagine that. And it was around the time of 9/11. It was like right after 9/11. And so, as you might imagine, I got to spend a lot of time with middle America and to really hear what they thought about what was happening at the time and their opinions about the war. And it was really a fascinating time where I learned a lot about the United States.
So, which is the casino town outside of, let's say, Vegas or Reno that I need to go to?
I think the town that I enjoyed the most, there was one in Mississippi, I cannot remember where. And it was really fascinating because the people there were very poor, but they were really happy. All of the people who worked at the casino were just some of the nicest. And it's like this tight knit community that was working together there. And I never really had that experience anywhere else. I mean, there's certainly lots of places in the United States that are really nice and friendly and all of that. But there was something about this one town in Mississippi that I was really struck by. Everyone there really seemed like a family more than coworkers.
Before we continue in your career, who are some of the music idols that you had growing up, whether from the composing side or from the performing side?
I think two of my musical idols that I think are probably worth sharing about. One is Jimi Hendrix. And what I really sort of took away from him is this idea of excellence in musicianship. Not that I necessarily am a great musician because I'm a composer. I'm really not a musician. I'm not a performing musician. I write music. But in his performance, like you really get this amazing virtuosity that allows him to write things that just really feel outside of the box. I've aspired to sort of do that. And the other side of it from him is also this palette of sounds that are really, like, again, they're outside the box. And I really have tried to do that in some of my artistic music that I've done, not necessarily for composing, because composing can be a very different thing. Like composing for film and TV is, I think, a different discipline. And in that vein, I also really gravitate to the work of Bernard Herrmann. I just find that the amount of emotion that he gets out of simple pieces of music is really inspiring. And I really try to do some of that in my own work. Well, there's three. One of the other influences, I would say production wise, would be the Bomb Squad or Hank Shockley and his team who did Public Enemy. And from them, I really sort of took this idea of collage, of not using just one instrument to play a melody, but using maybe multiple instruments and chopping them up and doing interesting things with them to create a sonic collage. Those would be three of the musical influences that I think you can hear both in the work I did as an artist and in the work that winds up as composition. Now, speaking of composition, you really have to think about my music is not sort of your traditional like score. That's not really what I've done a lot of. It's mostly been pieces of music that sound somewhat like pop music, but are thematic enough that they can be used in a film setting or a television setting or something like that. And that's where I've really found the most, I don't know if you'd say success, but the most use for my music has been in like reality TV shows where I take something that's like a pop idiom, whether it's like a hip hop or trap or electronica, and create something that really tells the audience what to feel. And that's what I think I really have taken from Bernard Herrmann's work. So, for example, I think one of the reasons that some of my music gets licensed over and over is that when you hear it, you know exactly what it's telling the audience how to feel. So, for example, if it's like you want something quirky comedy, like Kardashian Q, where you have pizzicato strings, it really nails that emotion communication for the audience. Or if you need something big and bombastic to say, well, now we're going to a big competition scene, I really try to deliver something that does that from the first two notes so that editors who are selecting music immediately know where they could use this music and if it's appropriate.
Is there a creative process that you take when you create a piece, like from beginning, middle to end, that you follow, or is each creation very different?
I think the difference really comes in what is the intention for the piece of music. There's some music that I have written for pop records. There's music that I've written for my own like artistic expression. And then there's music that I write for film, TV, and licensing. And each of those has a different approach. And I'd say the thing that I have focused on the most is film and TV licensing. And I can speak to that probably the best. And I definitely have a workflow, if you will, where I would start with what mood is this piece of music supposed to convey to a viewer? And recently I've been focusing a lot on stuff that's like big and bombastic for sports. So there I'll tend to start with drums. So I'll get a nice drum track going that I think really does what I want. Then I tend to find either guitar pieces or synth pieces. Then I'm sort of filling in the next layers. Like, what is the melody here, if you will? Even if it's not like a typical melody, what is sort of the melodic thing that the viewer is listening for? And then I'll think about what's supporting that, whether it's a rhythm guitar piece or something like that. And then there'll be sort of the last thing on the list is sort of the flourishes or the sound design or effect elements that are transitions or ear candy or that the editor can use to match the picture. That's kind of the four stages, if you will, of sketching out an idea. And then I'll go in and I'll fill out each individual section and clean it up. So I try to sketch something out first with those sort of four layers. What's the rhythm? What's sort of the melody, rhythm underneath the melody? What are the effect things that are happening? Then I'll go back and I'll, like I say, sketch in the details of each section so that I have a finished piece.
For me, I worked in TV, so we always had the eye candy, whether it was basketball dunk or football, it's a big hit. So in a similar vein, the video side and the audio side are linked because you have the big hit. You want the drum crash or have some kind of fan reaction. You want a swell, that kind of stuff. And the linking of it is so important because if anything's off, even by like a frame, a beat, it just doesn't work.
I think that what I'm saying in terms of ear candy would match those kinds of moments, things that an editor can use to highlight certain things. Even a crowd noise, sometimes I'll throw those in so that it gives an editor a clue. This would be a great spot to do something like that.
I know for me, when we used to do montages, some people call them glitzes, that there would be like a great hit, you hear the crunch, but that wasn't actually that hit. You could say, well, that actually was a hit from 2 years ago that we use from time to time when we don't have the greatest audio.
So much audio gets replaced. People don't necessarily know that. And it's a big part of what I do is you clean up the audio you have and then you sweeten it with stuff like you just said. You have a library of things that you add to make either ambience or, like you said, like a tackle hit, maybe something like that, that has a little more impact than what the audio from the actual recording had.
What does your studio look like? 'Cause I imagine it's probably pretty big with a whole lot of stuff.
I actually have cut down on most of my stuff. It's pretty simple what I have now. Right now, I have two desks. One is for audio editing, one is for music production. I do have a couple of keyboards, but most of what I have is inside the computer. Most of my synthesizers, the sounds, and all that stuff is all on the computer. So I can keep a pretty minimal setup. In fact, most of the things on my music desk have more to do with navigating software than they have to do with making music. I have a pad that I can create shortcuts so I can quickly do a sequence of things. I have a pad that has knobs on it so I can adjust things as if it was like a console. I think it's actually a relatively simple setup.
I want to go back to something you said a few minutes ago, talking about artists and layering, so to speak. Do you ever listen to Jeff Lynne, who, vocals aside, was known as the group Electric Light Orchestra, but basically did everything himself recording and brings in like studio guys or travel guys for the road?
Yeah, absolutely. He's definitely got some great songs. And I think there was this period in my production years where I was doing similar stuff in the sense of writing almost everything myself and then having session guys come in and layering stuff on top of it. And then I would take what they did and chop it up and remix it. And like it would totally change my song when I would do that. That was one of my favorite processes, was collaborating with other musicians and especially guitarists. I don't know why, but for some reason that collaboration process was always the most exciting for me, because I would take the parts they had played and I would chop them up. And like I said, I was really inspired by Hank Shockley and the Bomb Squad, and I would come up with new musical ideas based on what the guitarist had played. And they would pretty radically change my song ideas. And those kind of collaborations were just so much fun and really inspiring. And I had some great songs as a result of those. I don't do that so much anymore. Pretty much what I do now is almost entirely self-produced and played. In a lot of cases now I have access to a lot of great samples that I can modify in real time. So if I want a certain chord progression from a guitar, I can pretty much play an instrument that plays out what I have in mind. And that's been the amazing thing about how our technology has advanced over the years. Like what my original vision of in terms of collaborating with a computer is even more possible today than it was 30 years ago. With the advent of AI and text to audio, I mean, I can type in a prompt and say, oh, I'm looking to write a track like this. And I'll get something back that's, oh, okay, well, that's close. That gives me an idea. And then I can go and work with my computer to create something based on that idea. And I think the thing that I find is the most important is that sense of inspiration. I think that a lot of people, when they talk about having writer's block or creative block, for me, it's when I don't feel that sense of inspiration. And I have found that working with computers and in some cases using AI tools injects inspiration. I don't find it a replacement for what I normally do, but I do feel like I can ask a computer like, hey, can you do a mashup of heavy metal and death rock or something like that? And suddenly hear something. Oh, okay. Well, that's an interesting idea. Here's the direction I would take it in. So that inspiration, that question for me of like, ooh, let me start with that idea, but do it myself. That has really only, I think, increased over the years as the tools have become more powerful.
Early on in your career, did you ever have to do the razor blade to cut tape?
Absolutely. Like I said, my first real job in the industry was as an assistant engineer. And at the time, I was working on recordings of, I think it was either Dolly Parton or maybe it was a Ray Charles song that I was working on. Producer had hired me to work on one of these songs. And for both of them, I did some kind of drum programming, but then I was also the assistant engineer. And I remember having to splice tape. Like if you want the kind of edits that we do now and take for granted, you had to literally get out a razor blade and cut the tape, tape it up, and then put it on the machine and listen back. And did you get the edit right? I'm like, oh my God, no, go back, put the tape in. And not only that, actually cutting tape, actually aligning tape machines, because as you know, if tape machines come out of alignment. So going in and tweaking every last channel on a 24-track tape machine, all that stuff, man. And whew.
You're giving me nightmares of my intro and TV and radio class in college because we had to do that.
I think one of the most, I don't want to say primitive, but old school memories I have is working on a film. I think it was called The Favor. And I think it was one of Brad Pitt's first films. And the composer had given me his music mix on, I think it was a 1/4-inch reel-to-reel tape. And I had to take that over to the film editor's studio where he had the film on a real film, like actual film. And we had to synchronize them. And so we had reels of film and reels of audio, and we were trying to sync them up. If I think back, wow, that was such a manual physical process compared to what we do now, which is all digital, all in the box. And in many cases, you don't even have to think much about lining them up. In some projects, the way that it's done, it's sort of already synchronized.
Have you ever watched The Three Stooges and actually put together that none of the sound effects were actually happening when you're watching it? Like all of that stuff was post-production.
I haven't watched any of that closely. I'll have to check that out.
When I first found that out, and being a TV guy and stuff like that, it's like, wait, so they did that without any of that? That is unbelievable.
That's similar to today, thinking about all of the CGI that happens when actors have to look at a screen and point to something that just isn't there. And it's not there until post-production. Or they're acting with characters that are not there, or they're speaking to characters who are speaking in totally different voices than the actress who will finally play those roles. Acting is a really hard job.
You mentioned inspiration and how you get it. How important is the inspiration to have to create something that is to your level? Do you ever create something and be like, this is maybe not what I want to do, walk away for maybe a day and come back and kind of get it to where you'd like it to be?
Absolutely. Oftentimes during the creative process, you sort of can hit these walls where you don't know what the next right thing to do is. And I try to take a step back, come back later. I'm sort of getting at the key in my process, and that is if I'm not able to hear what the next right thing to do is, try a bunch of things. If I still haven't hit on it yet, then I move on to something else. And I have a hard drive that right now has about 120 ideas that aren't finished. They're in various stages of completion. So if I start something and I start working on it and that inspiration doesn't come, or I can't hear what needs to happen next, I can come out of that, go into another project and keep going down the row until I hit on something that, I know what this needs next. And then I can finish that up. I think the other side of that is sometimes when I'm not inspired, to just open up one of those tracks and listen. And 9 times out of 10, even if I don't feel inspired when I open up that session, I can normally hear at least one thing that needs to happen. And normally when I take that and I run with it and I do that one thing, I hear what the next thing is. But when I hit a wall and that's it normally means that I'm sort of creatively spent for the day and I need to just go and do something to fill myself back up so that I have creative energy to bring to the next project.
Speaking of being creatively spent, what do you do to kind of rebuild that energy, rebuild that inspiration away from creating music?
Lots of things. I have a family. I have 2 kids. So spending time with my 2 kids is a great way for me to fill myself back up. Physical exercise, being out in nature. I have a meditation practice that goes back decades. I really have been appreciating spending time with the family, engaging with all different generations of my family. And that's inspiring. Of course, listening to music, definitely find inspiring. And just watching the kind of media that I hear my music in is also inspiring. There's an opportunity. I hear something cool that they just did. Let me try something similar. I can take that to a different place. And I also get to listen to a lot of other aspiring composers' music because I've done a few networking tutorial workshops, and I get to listen to people who don't yet have a career in music who are trying to break through. I get to hear their music and I get to offer them feedback. Oh, here's something you should consider. Here's a piece of equipment that I think could help. Here's the person that I think could be right for you. And that process is naturally inspiring.
Paying it forward. That's my language. I love it.
That process is nurturing for me too.
With the name, is there any kind of pressure that comes with it because the name is so recognizable?
I wasn't born Roy Campanella III. My parents, who grew up during the Pan-African sort of movement, named me and my sister African names. So the name I was born with was Masembe. And when I was like 5 years old, I was in, it must have been first grade or something like that. I wasn't very nice to one of my classmates. I think I had hidden her school book or something like that. And I was about to switch schools. And I didn't really understand who my grandfather was, but I knew that he was someone that people considered to be a good person. And I got this idea that when I switched to the new school, I would use his name. And in doing that, I would be sort of deciding that I was going to be a good person and I wasn't going to do mean things to people anymore. And so I will never forget at my 6th birthday, which was held at my mother's parents' house. I'm there with those grandparents and uncles and all those family members. And they're like, okay, it's time to blow out the candles. And I'm looking at my birthday cake and they say, it's time to make a wish. And I say, from now on, I want to be called Roy. And then I blew out the candles and everyone was dead silent. This 6-year-old kid just said he's changing his name. And I remember somebody, I don't know who it was, said, oh, you'll change it back. And I said, no, I won't. And from then on, everyone called me Roy. But there was slight pressure in school for sports. But my dad, from a very young age, really made it clear to me and my sister that there was no family pressure along those lines. And my grandfather was the same way. And not at any time was he sort of pushing for that. In fact, one of my memories of my grandfather is he and I talking about architecture. When I was in high school, I was in an honors architecture class and he found out about it. And we had a conversation about how he had been interested in architecture when he was younger too. There was no pressure from that side. On the other hand, from some of the coaches, there was definitely people eyeing me like, hey, do you play ball? And I think that's part of the reason I didn't participate as much in sports as many of my friends did. The other reason was my dad's love of filmmaking really became a passion of mine too. And so I went more on the creative side of things. And by the time it really sort of mattered, I was really into music, computers, and all of that. But the other side of it was by the time I was using the name and out in the world, there weren't that many people who would bring it up. I mean, certainly more back in the 80s and 90s than today, but outside of the sports context at school, I mean, I might hear it from like a dentist. I think one of my dentists was like, oh my God, I can't believe you're Roy Campanella's grandson. Or I might hear it every so often when my name came up, like I had to give an ID for something or used a credit card, but it didn't come up as much as I think you might expect. I think the thing that was not pressure, but would have been nicer is if I knew more about sports. I don't follow sports. So people would always assume that they could have conversations with me even about the Dodgers and that I would know what they're talking about. And I'm much more into like the film world and like media than I am following sports and the Dodgers. There was this other story about my grandfather. I remember being at his house and we had this trophy room. I guess it was like a dining room that had been set aside with all of the trophies that he had and all of the awards he had received, not all of them, but a selection of them, down to the fact that the table in the middle of the room was actually an award. I don't know how to describe it. It was like a circular table with glass on it. And then there was like a plaque inside with an award. And what was great about this room was that it was like the family room. We didn't spend much time like talking about any of these things that were around us, but just having family time, playing card games or what have you. It was the place we just all hung out. And I will never forget one time being in that room with my grandmother who opened up a drawer and pulled out a letter. And she said, I think you should read this letter. This is something that I think you might find interesting. And I'm reading this letter, and it's from this guy who's saying, when I was a kid, I told the kids in school that I knew you because they were picking on me. And so I told them, oh, I know Roy Campanella. And all of them said, no, you don't. And they made fun of me for saying that I knew you. So as a kid, I wrote you a letter telling you that I was having a hard time at school. And would you consider coming by my school to show my friends that I knew you? And sure enough, one day, my grandfather drove by the school, got out the car, went up to this kid and showed to everyone that he knew him. And this guy is writing this further down the letter. He says, that memory and that kindness that you showed me really stays with me as I'm here on the battlefield in Vietnam. He says, the amount of, I think it was violence and ugliness in humanity that I'm experiencing, the only thing that gets me through it is remembering what you did for me all those years ago. And I think that was when I really understood the impact that my grandfather had on people's lives, that going beyond what he necessarily did in sports, but really what he gave to his fans. And the other side of that story is many years later, he and I went to a Dodger game, and it was kind of a family event. And I remember I was leaving and saying goodbye to him and looking back, and I saw that he was signing autographs for the fans. And we were heading to our car, heading home. And I realized that this is what he would do after every game that we would go to. He would stay and spend time signing autographs for the fans. And again, it just really impressed upon me how much he was giving back to his fans. And it really sort of embodied that 1950s spirit of all-American good guy kind of a thing.
In 2000, I interviewed a former teammate of your grandfather's named Joe Black, and he told a story. It was about, I think, like 2 years after the accident, might have been a little bit longer than that, but he and Sandy Koufax went to go visit your grandfather, and your grandfather said, whatever you do, don't help me out when I try to take this drink of water. And Joe Black said he actually had to stop Koufax from trying to help. It took your grandfather almost 5 minutes to drink a sip of water. And he said, to this day, that is the most satisfying drink of water he has ever seen anyone take.
Yeah, I love that.
I got so many stories about your grandfather when I was at that Negro Leagues reunion about how he was kind of everybody's uncle who's always looking out, and every one of them mentioned that if there was somebody's first time in whatever city, whether it was Brooklyn, St. Louis, Milwaukee, you could call Campy and he would know the restaurants, he would know the hotels, he would know where to go, where not to go. And he was almost this sage, if you will.
I think one of the things that a lot of people don't know is that ball players weren't paid what they are now. A lot of them had to have second jobs or a job that really bridged the money they were making from baseball and then the times that they weren't practicing or playing. And there was a lot of support that those guys needed. And certainly being an African American at that time in the country, you needed support. I haven't heard those stories about my grandfather. What's interesting is what I have heard are the stories from when he went to the major leagues and other players who helped him out or who were there for him, which is really beautiful. I'm really fascinated that Major League Baseball was able to integrate. I think it was like a decade before the civil rights movement happened. I really find that fascinating. And I mean, I guess that does say something about the idea of meritocracy and that sports, it's clearer in a sports context. I guess it was just like, well, why not use the best players? Right?
We've talked a lot about inspiration, and certainly you mentioned it even more with your grandfather. When you would see him and the trials and tribulations that he had to go through later in life, what kind of inspiration did that give you to say, well, if he can handle this, I can handle whatever challenges I have?
There's been many times where I've looked back at photos of him during that transition where right as he was starting to recover from the accident. And there's somewhere you just see his face and you see this light. And I think the thing that comes to me is there's nothing that I've faced that has been as great a loss, if you want to call it that, that he had in that transition, going from being this incredibly accomplished and capable athlete to being physically completely confined to a wheelchair and really relying on other people for some basic needs. If you want to look at it that way, I don't think that you have to, but one way of looking at that is, like I say, this transition from being completely capable and beyond the normal capabilities of most people to completely reliant on people. And there's nothing in my life that has been that dramatic of a transformation. So whenever I'm facing something, when I remember to reflect on that, that he was able to not only come out of that okay, but he had a whole other side to his life after that that was very much filled with hope and faith and belief. And anything that I'm faced with, I can definitely look at that and say, wow, can I find the light in this situation that I'm in? What is the lesson for me in this situation? What greatness can I grow into as a result of whatever circumstance I'm facing? And that's definitely from him.
Roy, I want to thank you so much for joining the I Play 2 podcast today and talking about your music career, where you get your inspiration, your creativity, everything and everywhere that your stuff has been played on. Thank you so much. Continued success, and we'll catch up soon.
Thank you, Rob. You too.